Our second paper deals with digital marketing inefficiencies, and it will be presented by Ken Wilbur from the University of California, San Diego, and Zsolt Katona from the University of California in Berkeley. The research examines digital advertising, which despite its many benefits, is argued in the paper to have a dark side, made up of waste, fraud, threats to brand safety in the media supply chain. Steps have been taken to correct these problems, but much remains to be done. The article reviews the main threats and offers remedies, so welcome Ken and Zsolt. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, John. And can everybody hear me okay?
You sound good, Ken.
Okay, thanks, Chris. As John mentioned, my name is Ken Wilbur. Zsolt is here. This is joint work with Brett, Kinshuk, Schreeder, and Jiwoong. I'm going to give just a brief overview of the paper and then dive deeper into the topic of measuring ad effects. So if you think back, comparing today to 15 or 20 years ago, digital advertising has made our lives so much easier. Instead of paying to reach all 4 people in a family at once, we can send individually targeted messages to any subset of the people in the family in times, places, contexts, and formats of our own choosing. And this is remarkably easy to do. And we have handsomely rewarded Facebook, Google, and other digital advertising companies for making this possible. The revenue growth in this industry has just been staggering. Despite these many benefits, especially in the last 1 or 2 years, there has been a drumbeat of concerns about digital advertising markets. Governments around the world have conducted years-long investigations and written volumes, hundreds of pages long, advocating new policy actions. Perhaps the most prominent came out last week from a subcommittee in the US House of Representatives with something close to a bipartisan consensus on the problems facing the industry. Reading these reports is interesting. They cover many important issues really well, but there are a few key issues that they either barely touch on or they ignore completely. And so, one of the motivations we had in writing this paper is to try to provide a marketing industry perspective on some of these key issues in digital advertising markets. The 4 issues that we focus on are ad effect measurement, that is, how advertisers evaluate the quality of the services they pay for. Organizational inefficiencies, which include principal agent problems and moral hazard, both within advertising organizations and in the advertising supply chain. Ad blocking, which can raise toll booths and harm publisher incentives to produce content. And advertising fraud, which is a collection of practices that misrepresents ad inventory and disguises machines as humans in order to steal ad spend. Our goal in the paper is not necessarily to advocate regulation. There are many bad potential regulations, and there may be some good potential regulations, but we've read some of these regulator reports, and our goal here is to make sure regulators are fully informed about the key features of these digital advertising markets that they are strongly considering regulating. And I don't mean to say that these are the only 4 issues that need to be considered. There are quite a few other important issues that are much better understood. We focus on these 4 because the discussion that we've seen to date indicates that these are the topics that are understood least well. And so from here, I'm going to dive deeper into ad effect measurement and how we can do a better job on that as marketers in the near future. So one of the underlying issues here is that ads are what academics like to call credence goods. even after you pay for a credence good, it's difficult to know exactly what it does for you. My personal favorite example is life insurance. This is something, you know, we pay into it for our whole lives, and we sure hope it's going to pay out, but we won't be around to know. And so it takes a relatively high degree of trust to reach efficient market outcomes. Now, in the context of ads, when we talk about what an ad does for the marketing organization that pays for it, we're gonna call that ad effects, and we're gonna define that as the incremental effect of an ad on consumer behaviors above baseline. And those last two words, above baseline, is gonna play a really important role in measuring ad effects. And so if you take a paraglider as an analogy, this person is going to strap a parachute to their back and go jump off a cliff, and an updraft is going to carry them up into the sky. And we can see how high they go, but if we want to assign proper credit for their height, there are two factors involved. One is the wind, which is similar to the role of advertising that pushes them up. But also a very important factor is the height of the cliff that they jumped off of. And so if we don't know the height of the cliff where they jumped, we cannot say what was the incremental effect of the wind over their starting point. And that's what we're talking about when we think about measuring baseline in the process of measuring ad effects. So we can always measure correlations between advertising and sales, but to measure true incremental effects, we need some kind of baseline. So a couple of quick examples will help to illustrate what we're talking about in the context of advertising. So consider this search I did a few weeks ago. I'm thinking about potentially buying an electric car. I searched for Tesla, and a Volkswagen ad popped up. And at the time, I did not know that Volkswagen sold electric cars. I clicked on the ad. I learned more about their cars. And I can tell you with confidence, I would not have visited their webpage if I hadn't seen the ad. So in this case, my baseline was clearly 0, and this ad definitely worked. Now, that's a relatively simple example. Let's look at one that's a little more complicated, but also a little more common. I got curious, so I searched for vw.com, which was the domain that was advertised in the previous example, and my top result was an ad for vw.com, and then I got 3 other ads, and then the top organic result was vw.com. Now, if this top ad was not here, what would happen? Well, there's a few possibilities. One possibility is that I might get lost in an irrelevant ad, and not visit vw.com. A second, very different possibility is that I might find the top organic link underneath these other 3 ads and visit VW without them having to pay for my visit. A third possibility is that I might just refine or abandon my search. And so you can see that in a messier or more realistic example, it's a lot harder to figure out what the baseline is. Now, before we go too much farther, I want to make it clear what types of ads we're talking about here. So if you classify digital ads by advertiser intention, we're not going to be talking about classified ads where it's generally pretty easy to measure ad effects because the baseline is typically 0. We're also not going to be focusing on brand ads where it's generally much harder to measure ad effects. We're going to be focusing on performance ads, whether those are search ads, display ads, social ads, mobile ads, anything where the advertiser's immediate goal is to produce some type of conversion that will contribute to revenues. So the easiest way to measure baseline is to just stop advertising. And if your sales go to 0, that means your baseline is 0. And the correlation between ads and sales is the same as the ad effect. So that might happen for new brands. It might happen in new markets. For some new products, But I think the more general case is going to be, if you were to stop advertising, your sales, they might fall, and the decrease might be large or it might be small. If your sales don't go all the way to zero, that means you have a positive baseline. And so we need to think hard about how to measure that baseline properly in order to measure the ad effect correctly. So, what do we usually do? How do we usually approach this problem? The most common techniques are lift metrics that compare outcomes between consumers who are exposed to our ads and consumers who are not exposed to our ads. Of course, those techniques ignore all of the targeting actions that we do to try to reach those who are most likely to respond. We're comparing apples and oranges. If you have more time and more budget and maybe a few more nerds, you might be running marketing mix models, multi-touch attribution algorithms. The key point here is that there's fairly widespread agreement that all three of these approaches tend to overestimate ad effects by assuming zero or low baselines. So the best evidence I know of on this topic was published by Brett and co-authors at the Kellogg School and at Facebook, where they reanalyzed 15 large-scale Facebook ad experiments. And the question was, how well do observational methods, non-experimental methods, how well do they work in estimating accurate ad effects? And unfortunately, the answer was largely negative, that correlational methods tend to overestimate ad effects, with a few exceptions. The takeaway from the research was that observational methods generally don't work for estimating accurate ad effects. So what just about every credible person agrees on is that the gold standard, the best way to measure ad effects, is to run experiments. Of course, experiments have many potential downsides. There's no guarantee that they will work. And quite a lot of people know this paper by Randall Lewis and Justin Rao, which was hugely influential on the advertising scientific literature. They reported 25 display ad experiments from yahoo.com. The average experiment in their sample had over 1 million people who were in the experiment. And they showed that only 3 out of those 25 experiments found significant ad effects. And the key issue is statistical power. Ads exert weak signals in noisy environments. And so you can think about the challenge of detecting ad effects using data as similar to listening for a whisper in a noisy stadium or catching a feather on a strong breeze. Now, what Randall and Justin concluded from their data was that ad experiments were nearly impossible, but a lot of scientists did not agree that conclusion followed from the data that they presented. There were multiple reasons. One was that they only tested the simplest possible designs. Those were A/B tests. And they only tested a single medium, which was national banner display ads on a single website. And perhaps most importantly, they didn't really use the spatial or temporal information in their data. And so in the following final 3 slides, I'm going to focus on how we can do better, both immediately, in the medium run, and then in the long run. So the first thing you can do, if you're not doing it already, is to take advantage of platform-provided experiment tools. Many digital advertising platforms are offering these freely to advertisers. There's a methodology called ghost ads, which is a great way to reduce the cost of experiments. Google is offering this, although you have to ask for it. They don't make it easy to find. This doesn't have to be provided by the platform. There's Randall Lewis founded a startup which recently sold to Sprinklr, where you can implement ghost ads on your own without the platform's involvement. Now, another important aspect here is you have to choose outcome metrics that contribute directly to leads or revenues or other costly consumer actions. I see far too many advertisers using ad views or ad clicks as outcome metrics. Those are measures of spend, and they're too easy to fake. Then you may need some cultural changes. 3 points. One, your employees are smart. You have to reward people for measuring failure and acting to improve things. Otherwise, they just won't do it. Number two, I recommend you do your experiments in-house. They are too important to outsource to external agencies that may have their own motivations. And number three, there's an old heuristic to budget 1% of ad spend to ad effect measurement. In my opinion, that's too low in digital environments. Personally, I would throw 5% at it to start, maybe even more. You can reduce that cost over time if you invest in setting up a repeatable system. Now, looking a little bit farther out, some of the best advice I can give you will be to create panel data sets of ad spend and the resulting conversions. Panel data sets are well known to maximize statistical power in experiments. So suppose at your organization, you're able to measure sales on a county-by-county and a date-by-date basis. Well, then you can set up a panel of 3,000 US counties on every date of the year, and then you can start implementing your own market time platform experiments, where you either go dark or randomly increase or decrease your ad spend in particular markets in order to get county-level baselines. This offers a number of advantages. One is that you can directly compare your experimental and correlational estimates. So if it turns out that your observational methods are doing a good job of estimating your ad effects, you can use those more often, and then you can run experiments less often. Or if it turns out that they consistently overestimate or underestimate your experimental estimates, you can adjust based on what you've tested with the best available methodology. You can also directly compare your ad effects across digital ad platforms, and that can really help to optimize your budget allocation. And then finally, and I'm going to make this quick because I'm running out of time, in the long run, the aspect that I think is most exciting and probably most beneficial is creating new structures to enable cross-advertiser learnings from advertising experiments. I think that's something the AMA and possibly other organizations might be able to help with to support their members. And doing this in the right way might be a little tricky. We don't want our competitors having direct access to our ad effect experiments, but I think there are a number of creative structures that can protect the interests of all involved. That covers most of what I have to say. Thanks for your attention. Zsolt and I would be really glad to answer questions and engage further on these topics.
Thanks, Zsolt and Ken. If you have questions, please put them in the chat section. We already have a question from Kun, which may have been answered. Kun's question is, do we need high accuracy at the individual consumer level, the kind of thing that you implied in that opening picture of 4 people sitting around a TV set? Do we need that level of accuracy, or can we allocate at a strategic level? And I think that, Ken, you talked about that when you talked about county level baselines. But would you like to elaborate on Kun Pal's question?
Sure. So it's a great question, Kun. Thank you. What I would advocate is looking to create a panel at the most granular level that you are able to reliably and repeatably measure your conversions, including instances of 0 conversions. And so I think the one caveat to individual level measurement is that many marketers will not be able to measure zeros at the individual level. And so, for some organizations, the right level might be the IP address. For others, it might be the zip code. For others, it might be the DMA, the county, the state. It might even be the retail partner and the territory that they serve. So it's hard to give a single piece of advice about the optimal approach there. But if it's possible to measure individuals, then that's great. But I think that's more of the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, if I may add, there's a whole industry or sub-industry around trying to match people to ad IDs and devices, and it's not a trivial problem. And it's questionable whether these matchings are very accurate. So the really individual level matching of an ad to a person, I think we are not really there yet.
So your talk and your paper, even more so, raise real questions about digital advertising. I mean, we all know the John Wanamaker line that from more than 100 years ago, that half of my advertising is wasted. I just don't know which half. And I took away from your paper the impression that maybe we still don't know which half. That despite the impression of precision in digital advertising, some of that ability to specify effects more accurately than we could on television might be illusory. Would you go that far? Would you say that that we have not gained in ad effect measurement by the adoption of digital methods?
So I think it's my turn. We agreed to take questions alternately. Ken was joking that I'll take the difficult questions. This is a difficult question. To some extent, yes. I mean, I heard from a CEO that, oh yeah, I have a good sense on everything I allocate money to, except that digital advertising thing. I have no idea what that money does. But let me also add that John Wanamaker, I think when that his quote, his point was that despite not knowing which half works, we still need to spend on advertising. So he wasn't trying to say that because we don't know, we should not spend on advertising. And I think in digital advertising, we can definitely kind of narrow that a little bit down. So it's not like we have no idea which half is working and which half is not. Maybe we can tell that 20% of our ads, we can tell that they are working, and the rest, 80%, we don't know which half is working, which half is not. But that brings up the total to 60%. So we are getting there. So I am a little bit optimistic in this sense, even though we are on the dark side. I think our main point is that we are getting there. It's much slower than everybody would expect, and maybe what the promises were.
Right. And I mean, your reframing of Wanamaker is very good, because he wasn't suggesting no advertising. He was just complaining that he was spending twice what he thought he would have needed to if he'd had better measures. And so the thrust of your talk here has been, yes, there are better measures. Not perfect, not easy to implement, but well worth doing if you want to spend your money more efficiently. I have a slightly different question. You mentioned at the start, Ken, that governments around the world have challenged digital advertising with threats of regulation, with threats of breakups and so on. But when you said around the world, presumably you didn't include China. Do you think that a world that contains regulated competitors and unregulated competitors may tilt the field in favor of those who are not regulated? I'm thinking particularly of the money that's being spent in the United States by firms like Alibaba and Tencent and TikTok and WeChat. Do you think that the playing field is tilting toward the unregulated markets?
John, that's a great question, and the one way to guarantee you'll always be wrong is to try to predict the future, right? So I think what I could say with confidence is that I think other countries would have moved forward with regulation before now if the US had been moving faster. In the US, we have these companies which can be viewed as national champions. And so the seeming bipartisan agreement about the problems that were described in the US House Subcommittee report, I think is giving other countries cover to move forward. But you know, what's interesting is that one of those Chinese giants, JD, has offered some of the best experimentation tools to date. So I think it's really an open question how this develops. There certainly are a lot of moving pieces.
Great, good diplomatic answer, and some promise there too. I thanks so much, Ken and Zsolt, for this really stimulating presentation. It could go on forever.